I'm here talking today to Grayson Perry. We're talking about these wonderful tapestries that are going on tour.
Right.
And your starting point for these, I think, was The Rake's Progress by Hogarth. And I'd just really like to talk to you about how you formulate your idea from that. What's your inspiration? And
well, it all started because when we got commissioned to make the series, Channel 4 were very keen that I took very firm authorship of it. And I said, well, I'm an artist, and what I do is make art. Well, they said, well, they said, well, why don't you make some art? I said, good idea, let's make some art about it. So use the series as a kind of extended research trip. And then I thought, well, we've got 3 programs to make, and there are 3 social classes. And I thought, well, 3 works won't be enough. And then I thought that 6. And then I thought about the most famous series of paintings in British art is The Rake's Progress by William Hogarth, which is 8 paintings. But that was my starting point with that idea. And of course, it's a perfect match because it's a tale of someone travelling through the class system of his day.
yeah.
And so it was a very easy parallel to draw. And it's something everybody knows. It's something I love. And Hogarth is like the kind of lodestone of British art. He's almost a person who kind of personified a certain sort of Britishness, Englishness. And so therefore, he was, it's the perfect model for me to start with. And so I called my hero of my story Tim Rakewell, after Tom Rakewell in The Rake's Progress. And they're different tales in many ways. I mean, Hogarth's hero, travels through the system because he inherits. And I wanted to tell a story of class mobility because that was a more contemporary, but curiously also a force in society that is becoming less easy because of the education system, and there aren't so many white-collar jobs available now. Class mobility is not such a common journey anymore. So there was an irony in it as well.
And do you think that, as an artist now, you're also kind of a social historian, aren't you, as well?
Well, I'm interested in social issues. That's my inspiration, is the way we all relate to each other and how the sort of trends in society and in the present day. And that's what I'm inspired by. And I'm particularly fascinated by the patterns of behaviour that we don't think about. So taste is a great one because it's something that we all have to have, because you can't exempt yourself. Having no taste is a form of taste.
Yeah.
Saying, oh, I don't ever think about that, default is an option.
Yeah.
It's a decision. And so but it's something that most people don't think about, why they choose what curtains or what shoes or whatever, a lot of the time, why they do that. And I was always been fascinated by that. And so, and I enjoy it because it's related to my interest in psychotherapy, which is also looking at the unconscious process. And so, I was fascinated by taste and class because they are very unconscious processes that we absorb with our mother's milk.
Yeah, yeah.
We take on board our class identity as we grow up, as children, without even realising it.
And the sort of 3 areas that you chose to actually film, why did you choose those areas,
Partly because they were kind of cliches of it, and they were easy to go for. Sunderland we chose because it wasn't Newcastle, and they were forever grateful to us for that. I mean, their rivalry seems to be very, very strong. And so when we chose Sunderland, they were so pleased. And people, every time we met someone, they go, thank you for not doing Newcastle, because we wanted to do a traditional working class community. Yeah. And all the people we took, we sort of made sure that everybody was happy to identify themselves as working class. And up there, of course, what you realise is that, the working class is a real thing. It's just that the work doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
But the working class, it carries on because social structures and emotional structures change much slower than the industrial landscape. So the shipyards have cleared away, but the type of society that grew up around the shipyards and the mines still exists. They have to find alternatives, which we found in things like the gym.
Yeah, and the cars, I think.
Yeah. And that's where the same sort of social binding goes on.
Do you think the first sort of tapestries that the working class are actually quite happy being working class?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, they're not burdened with the terrible affliction of aspiration, like the middle classes are. The middle classes are the ones that are, full of anxiety about where they fit in society. The working class are happy with their communal, existence, and the sort of all of their taste seem to be about binding the tribe together.
Yeah, because it's interesting that they still consider sort of shipbuilding as one of their sort of main industries, and yet there haven't been ships built there for years.
Yeah, when I asked people what to put on the tapestry, they would say, "Oh, we've got to put the mines and the shipbuilding," and I said, "But they don't exist. They don't exist, So when I came to the first tapestry, I put in, the miner's lamp being offered up by one of the cage fighters, and I put the picture of shipbuilding in the background, but it's symbolic, because the things themselves don't exist. And then in the second one, the kind of crucifix is a crane from the shipyards.
But you chose very sort of poignant things that came out, in those first two tapestries, because you had things like the singer and that holding of hand. I mean, when you see it on the film, it's actually very emotional, but I think there's an even stronger emotional pull when you see it in the tapestry. Yeah,
because I saw it. I wanted to also put in reference to other artworks, and so I referenced each artwork to a famous religious painting, and I wanted, when I saw the club singer Sean at Heppy's nightclub, and his mother's friend came up and held his hand while he sung his mother's famous song. It was like an altarpiece.
It was actually,
like a very strange kind of something from sort of Bruegel or Bosch, when there was this huge, great fat man sort of stripped to the waist, sort of jiggling about to the music, and it was all kind of quite surreal. But at the same time, I always find it more moving when it's kind of ameliorated somehow by ridiculousness. Because if there's one thing that the English sort of are most in fear of, is being earnest. And so you have to present emotion to them in a kind of complex recipe. You can't just serve it straight. Like the Americans are quite happy to deal with emotion in a kind of sincere, straight way. In Britain, you somehow have to kind of sneak it in under a kind of, in a different way.
And you're sort of talking to the people and taking sort of photographs. I mean, things that were also very moving, and you see it in the tapestries, are things like you've captured the graduation photograph, you've captured the horse, the cart horse and things like that, which were very important to that lady. I remember her talking about the fact that those things that she felt she belonged to something now, because she'd acquired these sort of artifacts. Yeah,
the lady who had the cart horse, she was like from a gypsy family, really, and so she could remember having real horses when she was a child, and you can kind of tell from her taste that she had that kind of Romany aesthetic in her house, which actually was a lot more sort of stylish than a lot of your typical granny houses. It was like a kind of Uber granny house, and the thing, and the what was the other thing you mentioned? The
graduation photograph.
Yeah, the graduation photo is a very powerful icon, because that shows, education as the way out of a working class identity in a way, and that for me is, one of my touchstones when I was making it was Stand Up Nigel Barton, the play by Dennis Potter, which I find very powerful. And if you look on I think it's on the third tapestry on the table, there's a book with that on the title, because I wanted to refer to that. The sort of, there's quite a few examples in British literature of sort of class mobility, particularly for that 60s generation that went off to Oxbridge and from the kind of real old-fashioned working class background.
But I mean, the working class obviously feel that if they have good education, that they can move up to the next.
Well, they used to be able to. That might be a fallacy nowadays, because of the kind of Blairite idea that half of us have to get. It only worked when it was a small proportion that went up for free, and then there were white-collar jobs for them to go into. Now that it's not, you're going to end up working for Starbucks with a PhD.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, The Agony of the Car Park, that was based on the Bellini, wasn't it? There was that reference to the Bellini piece.
The Bellini, yeah, it had a bit of that, and it had a bit of the Grunwald altarpiece in it as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, the actual sort of something about, the Agony in the Car Park, yeah, because yeah, that sort of prosaicness of it. I wanted to sort of, that was the thing that I was trying to capture in each one really, was that sort of mixture of the banal and the grand, and the sweeping references to those old Christian masterpieces sort of mixed with something that is very everyday in Britain.
And the thing that's also struck me is actually those first two tapestries. Everybody seemed actually quite happy with where they were. I mean, they're happy with their tattoos, that's their art, and they're happy spending huge amounts on their cars. I mean, there is no value in a way to
it's folk art.
Yes.
Those cars are folk art in a way. They might be annoying folk art when they drive past your house, but they're folk art. Oh. And they're not plagued by individuality like the middle classes are. Labour under this myth that they're meant to be individuals, and so I think that's the thing, really. I mean, it's like tattoos now. People will still, middle class people will profess some kind of individuality if they have a tattoo, but I see tattoo parlours as cloning parlours. They're for bringing you into the group rather than marking you as an outsider.
Yeah, yeah. As we sort of progress Tim's journey to that sort of the third tapestry, which is where he's sort of the expulsion from number 8 Eden Close. That's the sort of jump, isn't it? He's going towards middle class. Yeah,
that's why he's sort of walking through that rainbow, and his mother is sensing the fact that he's socially mobile because she's sort of has a sort of aggressively working class sort of loyalty, I suppose, and he's being welcomed into the sunlit uplands of the middle classes, and so he's walking through that miasmic barrier, which happens at university. Yeah, you start mixing with people who talk about culture over the dinner table, and taking on their values. You can't help but do that, and that's what happens that's why I think there's this strange generation now who have been exposed to that sort of transformative process and then kind of sold down the river. It's quite sad, really.
And then sort of moving on, Tim's, he makes that the Virgin Deal, which is sort of a play, isn't it, on words.
Yes.
And I mean, there were lots of lovely little references there with things like the vegetables in the Guardian, the penguin mugs and things like that,
They're all icons of that, that once you become a fully paid up member of the upper middle classes, and books are a very, very, big token. You've got to have a book-lined study. That's why writers always want to be interviewed in front of a kind of bookshelf. They're this sort of visible symbol of your learning, and the penguin mug is sort of an extension of that to a certain extent.
And did you think they were easier to interview, the sort of the middle class?
They were more, well, they understood more, they were anxious, but they also understood what you were talking about, and they were willing to pick it apart and have fun with it and blush. And when I felt I had permission, I would kind of tear into their choices. I can remember one man. I laid into this man because he had kind of ostentatiously raw-cut wood shelves in his kitchen. And wood is kind of one of those sort of symbols of authenticity, which is the other value that the middle classes really put a lot of store in. Which is why the whole sort of vintage, bearded, retro thing.
So the Aga and everything, it's all...
Yeah, it's about a kind of spurious authenticity, and is also differentiating themselves from the sort of branded bling of the working class. So they want something that has sort of a more heft.
So it's a more classy bling, really, but it's still kind of a badge, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's a sort of tasteful, natural. They love anything natural, or authentic or original. Yeah.
And then sort of as we move on, I mean, I found the upper classes probably the hardest to sort of look at and see. I mean, they obviously got their own style that they feel they've got to have. That was the impression.
Well, they're kind of locked, they're in aspic.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the guy, what's happened, I think, to the upper classes is that the process has become the content.
Yeah.
So before, where what you had was the thing that marked you out as upper class. Now it's the fact that you have it and you're preserving it is the fact that you're upper class. So therefore you're burdened by this huge property and all this land that you're having to pay tax on and upkeep on and whatever, and you feel duty bound to bankrupt yourself, keep going, rather than sell it to an oligarch. And it's, apparently now it's actually having a shift in the idea of, I was reading something about men in Switzerland the other day, and it used to be that they would inherit, the firstborn man would inherit the property, and therefore they would have the status. Now having that property is actually a downer. And so, the man that is free of property and the women that are definitely free of property are much freer to go and earn decent money. Yeah, you mustn't change it at all. You wear your grandfather's coat and, and you have a sort of 20-year-old piece of cardboard for instead of a clipboard.
But do you find that sort of bizarre that they're actually quite happy to take those possessions and continue to use them?
Well, they have their, that's their value, that's their tribal value system. I felt they were like a tribe in the Amazon or something where the logging was going on all around them, and they were little islands of sort of tribal ground, which they were all calling to each other across the county set, meeting up at polo matches and whatever. And it felt they were like, that's why I called them the endangered species.
I mean, that was a very sort of poignant image where you see the stag's head and everybody sort of baying for them, just in terms of just as a piece of hunting imagery. But the fact that is the upper class disappearing?
I think within a few generations the traditional upper class will probably be no more, because the children don't want to carry on that burden of duty, and they're interested in other things. They want to have their own lives, I imagine. So
can you see sort of all these mansions being sort of theme parks, or as you say, owned by?
Yeah, or National Trust or something, or hotels or schools or whatever,
And then sort of the last, the lamentation where poor old Tim, with his status symbol, dies. I mean, that's a very powerful image again, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing of it, he's a working class boy, and I wanted to kind of show that you can take the boy out of the working class, but you can't, take his taste away. And so that even though he kind of, for a while, kind of, wore a Barber jacket and strolled about the grounds of his Cotswold mansion, really he wanted a Ferrari.
And he was a boy racer at heart, which is what he wanted to do.
And so so that when he's got the money, he became a bit of a cheesy sort of modern upper class person.
What do you think you as an artist have learnt from this?
I've learned that of all the artwork I've ever done, it's the one that faces the public most squarely. We're not worried about the art world. When you go to art school and then you start exhibiting, and you're always facing the art world because you need to, because the market is there. Yeah. But this was the first time where I really made an artwork that faced not away from the art world, but certainly a lot more towards the public. And that was an interesting exercise, and having to do that without sort of losing your kind of identity as an artist and the kind of the potency of your work, because the public artwork is like that is a phrase that I have trouble with. Yeah,
but it conjures up all sort of.
There's so many. What's the word I'm looking for? There's so many kind of compromises you have to make, really, when you're making an artwork. Concessions. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, you also, I think one of the successes of it, that you attracted a whole different audience, didn't you? I mean, not only the people that were part of the tapestries. I mean, certainly some of the working class and even some of the middle class probably would not have gone to a gallery to see your work, and yet there they were.
Yeah, Sunderland, the people in Sunderland were delighted to see, they thought it was a good representation of them in the programme and in the tapestry. They liked what they saw, and they enjoyed them as artworks on a purely aesthetic level, because, they're colourful and big and fun.
They are bright. I mean, was that a conscious decision that you wanted to make them very visually, sharp and colourful and textural?
I think that comes out of the way they're made. When you work on pottery, colour is always a struggle. Yeah. Because they change so much, and the colours tend towards the earthy very easily. And so to have the luxury on Photoshop of using the entire spectrum and dazzling one at that, I get very seduced. And also I would sketch them
Yeah.
with felt pens as well, which would mean that I was drawn to the brighter colours.
I mean, you used a variety of techniques because obviously you used a digital camera to capture some of those moments. Then you're sketching and drawing, as you say, with your pens, and then you're on Photoshop. How do you sort of then transpose your ideas then onto the tapestries, like the textures and the colours?
I do a big drawing on Photoshop, very detailed. So the tapestry you see is exactly as how I drew it. But that is converted by various skilled technicians from my original file into the humongous file which runs the machine. And then all of those textures and colours are in the interpretation of my drawing. So, for instance, they can alter the tension of the stitches over certain areas, so you can kind of make it look like the outlines are kind of like almost quilted into the surface. And then the combination of colours that make up, because most of the colours are like a pointillist painting, and they're made up of lots of different thread colours. You can change the mix to give a sort of certain different sort of feel to each area. So there is and there's a very skillful guy in Belgium who kind of artistically interprets it, you know, to get the best out of it.
And did you sort of experiment with the sort of, because they are very textural, aren't they? When you look at them, it looks as if they're sort of layers and layers of colour.
There is layers and layers of colour in them. I mean, because the machine works where there's 25 threads one way, 25 colours one way and 10 the other way. And at any point on the surface of a tapestry, all of the threads are present. And they just bring them forward, you know, like pixels on a screen, really. And
for you, as a technique, does that give you? Do you think it gives you a lot of freedom as an artist?
Yeah, and that's the terrifying thing of any digital technique, is that it's blanker than a blank page. If you pick up a pencil and you've got a piece of paper, you are limited to what you can do with a piece of pencil and a piece of paper. But when you're working on Photoshop, the drawing could be 100 meters long or 100 millimeters, you know, and it can be in any texture, in any color, in any material, because the delivery systems now, you know, they're there for if I want to put it on the side of a van or on a t-shirt or on a, you know, the side of a building, I can. And so you are forced to make decisions yourself. The paper and the pencil has made a lot of the decisions for you, you know. And so that's the terrifying thing of working digitally, is that you are thrown onto yourself. You're thrown onto having to make the decision. It really highlights the fact that I am going to do it in this style and in these colours, you know, and you have to make decisions. And you know, every decision you make, of course, the more you have to exclude. Yeah. And that can be quite galling, I think, at first.
I mean, it must have been sort of going back when you were choosing the subjects. There must have been so much that you wanted to put in, and then you sort of have to pile that all down. And
there's certain things that are, you know, had a powerful meaning. I mean, it was a series of artworks I've been working up to for a long time. You know, it was an artwork based on 1,000 conversations sitting in a cafe watching the world go by and looking at people's shoes. You know, so it wasn't quick in coming. You know, me and Neil, the director, wanted to make the series because we were both fascinated by the subject, and it curiously hadn't been tackled that much by TV. So you know, we thought it was a good subject.
And do you think people can recognise their class?
A lot of people will kind of pretend that they don't, but of course they do. They just don't. Maybe they just don't think about it, and of course that's when it becomes dangerous. If you don't think about it, then you can't control it. You know, awareness is the first tool of change. So if you're not aware of it, then you're stuck with it, basically.
And you know, I think you've said before that you sort of come from working class, you're middle class now. You seem very comfortable with it, but do you think everybody, or a lot of people in that film, were comfortable with the way that they were changing, or?
I think everybody, you know, I don't think anybody was really suffering from being in the position that they were in, because there's good and bad about every position in society, you know. And we deliberately didn't do what people call the underclass. Because you know, that's a different issue that's a different type of social force. There's not a lot of choice often going on there, you know, and we're talking about people's choices really, because, you know, we could probably find a working class person that we interviewed that had the same income as the upper class person.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, I mean, this body of 6 tapestries at the end, I mean, it is a real record of our social history now. What do you think in sort of maybe 100 years' time, when somebody's reviewing your work, like Hogarth's work is reviewed, what they'll think of us as classes? I
think the tricky thing is that, you know, I operate in a world now where practically everything is documented. And so, you know, will that be the primary reason? You know, in Hogarth's age, you know, he's documenting. He is the Pinterest of his day. You know, he's putting up all the photographs. You know, and now, I mean, I think one thing I've learned as an artist, you should never be scared of being of your time and place. I think a lot of artists now, they're worried about globalization and they want to make an artwork that's somehow relevant to someone in Buenos Aires, and I'll kind of get off it, you know, operate local, you know, and do it. And that's because all the artworks I love are of their time and place.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I suppose one of the other things, as you sort of touched on, is that there are so many mediums that people will be able to view it, but the tapestry is one of the oldest forms, isn't it, and actually something of the upper classes really would have captured in the past, and here it is capturing everybody. Yeah,
they're still expensive, and most of the people that bought them, you know, are certainly in the upper income brackets. So, but they're a kind of monument, yeah. They were public. What I liked about the medium of tapestry was that you can, you know, pack it up in a van, carry it around the country. It's easy to transport and display. It's big, so lots of people can look at it easily. So it's a perfect medium. You know, it's certainly the most. You know, it is a piece of public art that I've made, and that I'm glad of that.
And do you think people actually are more comfortable with something like that? They can feel and touch?
Well, I think, you know, it's democratic in that the miscellany of things that get made under the banner of contemporary art now are mystifying to a lot of people. You know, and most people, when they go into an art gallery, still respond to things, objects, and figurative objects at that. You know, and so in many ways, you know, my series of tapestries is easily accessible.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is a plus.
Do you consider yourself an artist of the people?
Yeah, I find it interesting because it's an uncomfortable for the contemporary art world. Because it's still patting itself on the back of its rarefied and sophisticated taste.
Do you think you've blown away some of the mystique of it?
I'm in the process of it. But yeah, you know, it's something that needs to be done. But it's interesting in that the market is still, you know, fascinated by the difficulty of a lot of, you know, when you look at the things that sell at auctions, quite often they wouldn't be that accessible to people. You know, the first time I went to a contemporary art auction, and I think it was a Vita Selmin's drawing, went for $1 million. I thought, bloody hell, $1 million for an A4 drawing of the sea. That's a weird one.
But does it scare you that your work goes now, you know, for
lots of money? I think I left behind what I call a respectable hourly rate quite a long time ago, and, you know, up to that point I used to say, you know, I used to work out how long things took me and what I got for them. I thought, yes, a decent, you know, workman's rate for that. But I left that behind quite a while ago now. And so it's now when I sell something, it's just what people will pay for it. You know, I make so much. I don't make a lot of work. I'm not the most prolific artist because I'm on my own. So.
And having, you know, made this wonderful sort of body of work as tapestries, will that influence the way that you make, you know, you style your pots? You know, are there any things that you'll take away from that and think, oh, I could use that when I go back to my ceramics?
Maybe. I mean, it'll take a while, you know, because things bleed through slowly. I like having lots of different strings to my bow, you know. So I like making the pots, I like doing prints, I like the tapestries, I like the cast metal, sculpture, and various other bits and bobs I do. You know, I like having that variety. I go, yeah, because just the tapestry, the thing is with the tapestry, you just become another drone worker in front of a screen. I'm doing one at the moment, you know, I've already put in 3 weeks in front of another tapestry, and on the screen you're just coming in 8 hours a day, sitting there, working away.
Yeah, I was going to say, are there any other tapestries? But clearly there are that you're sort of working on projects.
Yeah, I've got 2 more in my next show.
Brilliant. Grayson, thank you very much.
Thank you.